Or a big welcome. Let me get my grammar wrong in front of a bunch of school teachers. Welcome to the Institute for Advanced Studies Thursdays at 4 presentation, which is atypically in the Best Buy Theater. That's where you're sitting right now. I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. And before we get on to the real reason everybody is here, I just want to make a couple of announcements. Cue the first one. So, as some of you probably know, the Institute for Advanced Studies sponsors residential fellowships for University of Minnesota faculty, and the deadline for the applications for that for 2016-2017 will be October 23rd. And we're holding information sessions on the St. Paul campus and here on the East Bank on October 7th and 8th. And you can find more information about the applications and also about the information sessions and a slideshow from the information sessions from previous years on our webpage. And next week, our Thursdays at 4 presentation will be downstairs, back in its usual space in the Crosby Seminar Room in the second floor, northeast corner of Northrop. And our speaker next week is historian Ari Kelman from Penn State University. You might have been reading about his recent graphic history, a book published with Jonathan Feder-Vorm called Battle Lines, A Graphic History of the Civil War. But his talk next Thursday is based on the topic of his award-winning book, A Misplaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek. And so I hope you'll all come out again next week for Ari Kelman's talk. And last but not least, today's talk will be followed by a reception outside in the gallery. So if you go out either side and go towards that back wall, that's where the gallery is. And we hope you'll join us for that. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce the people who will introduce our speaker, Julian Vasquez Heilig, who is a professor of educational leadership and policy studies at California State University, Sacramento. His talk today is titled Education Reform, What Instead? Community-Based Education Policy as the Alternative to Top-Down Private Control. And this conversation today has been initiated by the IAS Collaborative, Private for the Public Good. And it's also co-sponsored by the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy and Development, the Department of Communication Studies, the College of Education and Human Development, and the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies. So I want to introduce to you the conveners of the IAS Collaborative, Private for the Public Good, Mary Bevers and Rusbe Shirazi. And they will tell you more about their collaborative and introduce Dr. Vasquez Heilig. So I can't see into the lights. So Mary Bevers is Associate Professor of the Department of Communication Studies, where she teaches critical media studies. And her own research and teaching are informed by community engagement, particularly her relationships with many public school teachers. And she, like many of us, have watched how the struggle with the increasing quantity of high-stakes testing that current policy imposes on school teachers and schools is a constant source of tension. And this has dovetailed with her own research, examining the multiple roles that media play in legitimating policies that reproduce social inequalities, particularly around class, race, and gender. So Rusbe Shirazi is awesome. He did not write that in his self-bio. I just want you to know. No. He's. We think Rusbe is awesome, and in fact, he'll be an IAS residential fellow in the spring. So we're looking forward to having him. He's a faculty member in the program in Comparative and International Development Education in the College of Education and Human Development. But in a previous life, he was a public school teacher in a state-controlled district in New Jersey. And that was really a formative experience that opened his eyes to the perils and limitations of top-down control and high-stakes testing regimes. So his research looks at how schools in the U.S. and the Middle East serve as sites for making political meaning and framing social belonging. And he's been doing that work locally here in the Twin Cities, paying particular attention to the experiences with schooling of transnational and immigrant youth in a time in which we're witnessing heightened surveillance of immigrant communities. So without further ado, Mary Bevers.
Thank you, Jennifer. My role today is to give you a brief overview of our collaborative that has culminated in bringing Professor Vasquez Heilig here. But before I do that, I want to be sure to thank a few folks who've made this all possible. We'd like to start with the IAS. Thank you to the IAS for all the generous support of money and expertise that you've given us that made this collaborative possible. I'd like to thank Anna Farrell, our graduate assistant, who has done a whole lot of work over the summer to make everything happen over these next 2 days. And I'd like to thank my co-convener, Ruth Shirazi, who's been a real inspiration, has great ideas throughout the year this project has developed and evolved. So thanks to all of you. And I want to start with a story today because it really illustrates the way in which we've conceptualized private for the public good, media treatments of education, citizenship, and opportunity. On Tuesday, I was working at home, and my 18-year-old cousin, who lives with us, came home from school, and he was all smiles and wanted to tell me something that he decided. He said, I made a decision. And because he's a senior in high school, I thought that decision might have to do with which colleges he had planned to apply to, or how he was going to study for the ACT, which is coming up. But in fact, neither of these was true, because what he wanted to tell me in very excited terms was he had decided that when he had children, he was sending them to private school because he knew they'd get a better education there. Which, of course, gave me a visceral reaction that I had to tame pretty quickly so that I could engage in the vigorous defense of public education that I did. After that vigorous defense of public education, he went upstairs to do his homework. I stayed downstairs to fix dinner, all the while thinking about what had just transpired between us. And I'm telling you this story because it illustrates the way in which we've thought about private for the public good, and the ways in which the idea that private schools, private systems are superior to public systems. Where does that notion come from? How is it that an 18-year-old boy who, to my knowledge, has never really thought about these things before can assert with so much confidence that he knows that the private system is superior to the public school system? And Rusby and I believe that the mainstream media in this country have constitute a very important, maybe the most important site where these kinds of ideas proliferate and get transmitted and then are taken up by people like my cousin and plenty of other people as well. So over the course of our collaborative, what we have done is to look at all kinds of different media when they focus on the issue of K through 12 public education. We've looked at documentary films, Waiting for Superman, for example. We've looked at fictional film, Won't Back Down. We've looked at television programs. We've looked at news reports. We've looked at old public service announcements. And what we have kind of depressingly concluded is that the mainstream media do, in fact, have a dominant narrative about public education. And it seems to be in two parts. The first part is that there is a crisis in public education. There is an established sort of article of faith in these narratives that there's a crisis in public education, and at this moment that crisis can be traced to bad teachers, administrators who want to keep bad teachers in the classroom, and teachers' unions, by and large. The second part of the narrative is the remedy that the media that we looked at suggest for this crisis in public education. Remedies typically consist of very privatized sorts of remedies. So increasing the numbers of charter schools, increasing the numbers of and the stakes for the testing that's involved, and eliminating teachers' unions. And the concerns that we have about that dominant narrative are many, but one of them is that there's very little resistance to it. We found very little pushback, at least in the mainstream media, to these particular narratives, which was giving us pause, to say the least. So when we encountered the work of Professor Vasquez Heilig, we were quite delighted, because his talk today, and I won't give you too much information about it, but his talk today is all about constructing an alternative media ecology, as he calls it, one that can challenge these kinds of conventional wisdoms and the common sense belief that private solutions and private education is the answer to public education's problems. So I'm looking very much forward to hearing from Professor Vasquez Heilig, and I'm going to cede the floor to my colleague Bruce Shirazi, who will introduce our guest today.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today and braving the fine fall Minnesota weather that we're having here. I just want to take a second to thank Mary. It's been a pleasure working with you over the course of the past year. And I think just in that brief introduction, you can kind of see how she can take very big ideas and distill them down to something powerful, something concise, and something really interesting to be able to talk about. So it's been really fun working with you, Mary. Thank you very much. I also want to take the opportunity to thank a few guests who are here with us today, or who will be with us if they're not here right now. Representative David Bly, Representative Rena Moran, Betsy Orn from Minneapolis Public Schools, Tola Oyewole, who's the director of the Cargill Foundation, Michael Go, who's the Associate Vice Provost for the Office of Equity and Diversity here at the university, and Dean Jean Kwam from the College of Education and Human Development. So thank you for being here, for participating in this event, and being present, and contributing your energy and goodwill. I don't want to cover too much of the same ground that Mary did, but one thing I'd like to add to everything that we've said so far. One of the themes that emerged from in the discussions of our work as we're reviewing these movies, particularly how recent films like Won't Back Down, or recent-ish films like Waiting for Superman, what emerged for us was we saw that these are highly motivated representations of education. They're fighting for hearts and minds by drawing primarily on viewer emotions to depict the crisis in education at the expense of presenting well-developed arguments backed up with data. For those of you who haven't seen either of these films, the climax, and I would say both of these films, hinges around a lottery scene in which parents and students are anxiously waiting to see whether or not they get in. And these are a perfect example of kind of the work that media does in shaping the way that we think about public education. The films have this powerful emotional effect because they're depicting this overflowing demand on the part of low-income students, students of color and their families, for successful schools, schools that work, that serve them. Because the neighborhood schools that they attend, public schools more often than not, have not been up to the task. What these scenes do not depict, and as I learned in my conversation with Dr. Vasquez Heilig today, is that access to these schools is often limited by eligibility criteria that keep certain children and their families out. So they're not necessarily open to all, even though they're being depicted as a solution for everyone. So in this sense, it's important to note how our emotions are being weaponized in this debate. The focus is kept on expanding access to these schools that work rather than investing energy and resources in public schools that serve the needs of all students. And the difficulty of critiquing some of the reform agendas that are proliferating right now is often tied to the lack of transparency around their data, while public schools are generally subjected to much higher levels of scrutiny. So when we started thinking about who we wanted to bring to speak to some of these issues and whose work addresses these issues head on, Dr. Julian Vasquez Heilig came immediately to mind. He's worked in school districts, he's worked in Houston Public Schools, and he's seen up close how the movement towards greater accountability and high-stakes testing has negatively impacted public education. And through his blog, Cloaking Inequity, he has helped jumpstart and contribute to a national conversation about what kind of schools we need, and has brought some empirical clarity to critiques against the corporatizing models of education reform that are prevalent and occupying the stage in discussions of education reform. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Julian Vasquez Heilig to the stage. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for bringing me here to the University of Minnesota. Also thank you for not bringing me in January or February. California is very lovely at this time of year. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a 3-for-1. Right? You go to 7-Eleven, they have the hot dogs, and they say 3 hot dogs for the price of 1. When we originally talked about this, I conceptualized this talk as being primarily about the different types of reform. But you know, I'm a policy analyst. I can be wonky, and I can get deep into and that might not be as interesting. So I want to do 3 things for you today. And I also want to invite you, for those that are tweeters, to tweet at me from the talk, if you're able to, at Professor JVH, which is Professor and then my 3 initials, JVH. So the 3-for is this. First, I want to discuss context. I recently gave a talk at Berkeley, and I jumped right into the community-based reform. I jumped right into the social media ecology, and I had some blank stares. So I want to start a little bit with the context of top-down private control reform, and then go to a conversation about the community-based approaches as alternatives to top-down reform. And then I'm going to get real personal and talk about how you as a person, you as an individual, can build your own social media ecology around education policy. So I will now begin with the current top-down private control school reform context. I believe we should call it aristocratic or perhaps plutocratic reform. I'd like to start with this portion of the conversation by introducing the 4 main components of what I'm calling aristocratic reform. First, aristocratic reform is controlled by the elites. It's top-down. It provides opportunity for profit and privatization, and they're often swathed in elegant but false narratives of civil rights. Are these approaches consistent with a vibrant democracy and democratic control of schools? Who are the aristocratic reformers? You're probably familiar with most of their names. Michelle Rhee, who's married to the mayor in my city, Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor Emanuel, the Democrats for Education Reform. But where are they getting their support? Where are they drawing this, what they call dark money, that fund aristocratic reform? Wall Street, wealthy elites, foundations such as the Gates Foundations and other corporate entities are underwriting aristocratic reform. The Democrats for Education Reform, for example, is a political action committee supported largely by hedge fund managers. They favor charter schools, high-stakes testing, school choice, including vouchers and tuition tax credits. In some cases, I consider essentially money laundering public policy, mayoral control, alternative teacher preparation programs such as Teach for America. Dan Ravitch has taken to calling these billionaire funders the Billionaire Boys Club. There are many examples of aristocratic reform that can be discussed here today, but I will focus on just a few of the hot topics that are currently being discussed. Chicago, not far from here, is right now in the public consciousness because of the recent hunger strike that lasted more than a month at Diet High School. Parents, grandparents were protesting the purposeful lack of an open enrollment, community-based public school in their neighborhood. Who was responsible for this situation? Rahm Emanuel, famous bundler of Wall Street and other big money, brought his brand of aristocratic reform to Chicago. The mayorally appointed school board in Chicago, is that how you say it? Has been keen on cutting budgets, closing schools, especially those in minority communities, and then sending those same students to different low-performing campuses. Chicago is not the only epicenter of aristocratic school reformers. Their gospel is also being spread across the nation via the New Orleans Takeover model. Despite national and state-level data demonstrating that the Recovery School District and the state of Louisiana perform last and nearly last in every single educational outcome, they're being promoted by proponents. Legislators are simultaneously filing bills to create New Orleans-style achievement districts across the nation. Is this purely coincidence? ALEC, a lobbying conglomeration of corporations, has spread model legislation across the nation seeking to take the chartering of schools out of the hands of local officials and place it in the hands of politically appointed charter boards. In Texas, for example, a group of wealthy businessmen, including John Arnold, a billionaire, a former Enron trader, bankrolled an attempted hostile takeover of the entire Dallas school district under an obscure Texas law from the 1990s called Home Rule. Fortunately, the community pushed back, and the takeover fell through, at least for now. Even in a progressive place like Washington State, aristocratic reformers have made headway. ALEC language was directly plagiarized and codified in a proposition for school choice. This reported by Wayne Out. This mattered until the Washington Supreme Court recently ruled that public money for privately controlled charter schools was not consistent with the state's constitution. Why would hedge fund managers and other aristocratic reformers like to see chartering taken out of the hands of democratically elected government officials and local communities and instead handed over to politically appointed boards, or see entire districts taken over, chartered, and run by politically appointed boards? Aristocratic reformers are focused on a few elites being in control of districts and schools rather than democratically controlled education policy. Disingenuously, they simultaneously promote this elegant but false narrative of civil rights and economic efficiencies as the primary benefit of these top-down approaches. However, what the anti-democratic policies really offer is the opportunity for elites to profit handsomely from the education system by privately controlling the capital associated with our public school systems. As observed in Chicago and elsewhere, charter schools offer new opportunities to profit from sweetheart construction, land, and lease deals. They typically offer double and triple the rate of returns on bonds to Wall Street compared to traditional public schools. For-profit charters are able to skim dollars off the education of every child. The online charters are a prime example of this. Some charters have even become lucrative vehicles for creating income-based loopholes in immigration laws. Across the spectrum, aristocratic policies are constructed such that a few elites control the policy rather than our local communities. For example, if the Home Rule takeover had gone through in Dallas, a politically appointed board would have had control of a $1 billion, that's billion with the B, budget, likely without any democratic public accountability or oversight. In fact, did you know that the New Orleans Recovery School District has been sued by various members of the public, including academics, to release its data to people other than those that have handpicked politically? And now, only after 10 years, has the RSD been forced by the Louisiana courts to release their data to people other than those handpicked politically. My mother always says, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Another notable common denominator amongst aristocratic reformers, such as Rahm, Reed, the Koch brothers, and many others, they're anti-union. For the Democrats, this has been a really confusing journey. In the past, it was left up to Republicans to brand unions as terrorist organizations. Now the aristocratic wing of the Democratic Party has taken to criticizing unions too. And I promise this quick commercial. A quick plug for the organizing rally that goes until 6 p.m. right in front of this building. I am proud California Faculty Association, son of a Michigan Nurses Association member, grandson of UAW workers, and great-grandson of a United Mine worker. I stand in solidarity with SEIU. In fact, I believe that teacher organizations are a key constituency for defeating Wall Street and the rest of the aristocratic reformers. I don't think anyone can explain this position or say it better than Martin Luther King Jr. The labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. Which brings me to the ongoing reauthorization of ESEA. For you non-education folks, that's No Child Left Behind currently. There are competing proposals for the revision of this wide-reaching education law on the conference table. The teacher organizations have placed a variety of community-based, democratically controlled ideas in the conversation, including dashboard measurements, which I will talk about in just a moment. But what the revision of NCLB still has in common with its former and current self is that the primary policy mechanisms leave control in the hands of a select few politicians and elites, not the communities in which schools reside. For Republicans who espouse local control and Democrats who support community empowerment, a revision solely by erasure of the most egregious while leaving the best base system in place is a disconnect. However, with the aforementioned context of dark money and that's controlling politicians and the discourse, it is readily apparent why the education policies of then and now continue to have a top-down, aristocratic reform flavor. To be consistent with their political ideology, it would make more sense for Democrats and Republicans to consider empirically based, democratically controlled education reforms in the reauthorization. So you're asking yourself, what are those alternatives? That's what I was promised. What are the alternatives to aristocratic school reforms discussed today? I posit democratically controlled community-based education reform. For each of the top-down reforms proposed and presented by aristocratic reformers, there is a community-based alternative. Here are a few examples. So I first got my start. I finished at the other U of M, the University of Michigan, in the 1990s, and I moved to Houston. What I didn't know is that I arrived in Houston in the middle of a maelstrom. That was the accountability and testing miracle that actually never happened in Texas. No Child Left Behind was imported from what Texas had been doing for a decade with accountability and testing, and it became the law of the land. But what we knew in Texas at the time was it was a facade. It was never a miracle. Texas had never had an education miracle. They'd never had high schools with 0% dropout rates. They'd never closed achievement gaps. They had in-run-tized the data. So what is an alternative to top-down approaches to testing, but more specifically in this case, accountability? Well, about 4 years ago at the University of Texas, we started a work group to think about how can we do accountability in a bottom-up way? How can we be more constructivist? How can we put together a measure of schools, a measure of districts that was a multiple measure approach, but also provided community input? We called it at the time community-based accountability. Well, 2 years ago, California codified a bottom-up approach to accountability. They call it local accountability. And this is an alternative to the top-down approach that has been the law of the land since Bush and Secretary Page imported what Texas was doing. So what happens is communities put together strategic plans that are short-term and long-term, and they have multiple measures. These multiple measure approaches focus on special populations, at-risk students, ELL students, and foster students currently. And in those processes, community organizations get to work together with the district to set the priorities. The thing, if you think about No Child Left Behind, how much say or how much input do local communities have in did they have in AYP, Adequate Yearly Progress, or any of the other metrics in NCLB? The answer is none. So there are ways in practice, and California is a prime example of this, that you can do accountability in a bottom-up, community-based approach. We are 1 year in. We've written a few things that will be coming out in peer-reviewed literature. There's still work to do on this issue, but you can do accountability in a bottom-up, community-based way. It doesn't have to be top-down. It doesn't have to be focused primarily on exams. You can consider a variety of measures, the things that we really care about. Exams, we believe, are a proxy for what we care about in our society. But why not actually consider the measures, whether it be disparate disciplinary rates, whether it be college attendance rates? We have all that data now. So why not consider that data as communities rather than tests as a proxy? Now, speaking of tests, how many of you had spelling tests on Friday? Something, right? Okay. Now, if you think about assessment 20 years ago in this country, Think about assessment 30 years ago in this country. Assessment was essentially on the local level. Now, what we haven't been talking about is what No Child Left Behind did was it privatized assessment. It made assessment top down because at the federal level, they had certain requirements for what had to occur in each and every state, right? And who came to fill that gap? Pearson and the other testing companies, in collaboration with states, created these criterion-based tests that met the requirements of the legislation. So essentially what happened is we, with No Child Left Behind, experienced the privatization of assessment. That's a different approach than what we've seen over the last several decades in our school. So there are examples, and there's the opt-out movement is very prominent here. With the onset of the Common Core test, these are all, I think of them as they have similar stakes. They may be different tests, but they have similar stakes and similar consequences. That's why they're high-stakes exams. So the conversation should be, how do we change the stakes of these exams so that they can be more instructive and valuable for educators? And the second thing is, how do we do assessment in a community-based, bottom-up way? Monty Neal and the Fair Test folks have many examples of how in New York, a set of schools have approached assessment in a community-based way. So assessment does not have to be privatized. It does not have to be top-down. We have examples, empirical examples of how we can do assessment in bottom-up ways. So when we evaluate teachers, it's linked to these assessments. And so what we see with value-added models, so these are multi-level statistical models that are used to evaluate teachers. And a person like me can sit in an office and tell the district, this teacher's not so hot. That teacher's not so hot, because I've calculated this formula. But it turns out that these formulas are unstable. 70% of the teachers move between categories year to year. Now, is the reason why those teachers go from bad to terrible to good to bad, is it because they're bad teachers or terrible teachers or excellent teachers in a particular year? It's the vagaries of the statistical models, right? And so the thing is that the value-added models that aristocratic reformers are pressing, Arne Duncan and others, are a top-down approach, often privatized, farmed out to consultants such as Sanders and others. But there are bottom-up approaches. For example, PAR, Peer Assistance and Review, is a bottom-up approach, a community-based approach where expert consultant teachers do evaluate the teacher quality of teachers across the district. So you have actual experts instead of a number cruncher like me sitting and deciding based on a hierarchical linear model, which is just multi-level models, who the good teachers and the bad teachers are. And then finally, let me loop back to charter schools. I've been called a charter school lover and a charter school hater in the same week. What a lot of people don't know about me is I was an instructor at a charter school. I sat on the board of the UT charter school. My daughter attended the UT charter school. So I've really pressed myself to think very carefully about the charter school movement. What I consider to be problematic are those charter schools that ignore equity and access in some of the ways that Dr. Shirazi talked about, and the 12 ways that Kevin Wellner from the National Education Policy Center talked about in his Dirty Dozen. We must hold charter schools accountable. They should not be public schools that act like private schools. And so can we do charter schools in a way that's not corporate? You see a set of charter schools from Arizona, Basis charter schools, Great Heart charter schools. A, they only situate their schools in wealthy neighborhoods. B, if you don't cut it, if you academically, or if you don't follow the student code of conduct to the T, then they will expel you out of the charter school. So the question is, do we also want charter schools that are nonprofit in name only? Because what they do is the charter school board will run the business of the school through a for-profit arm of the school. And then you ask yourself, well, how do you get on a charter school board? Well, Minnesota is one of the rare places where a charter school board functions differently than other places, and there's some communities say in charter school board, but that in Minnesota is unusual in that regard in the whole United States. But the point is that we should think about how we do charter schools in a community-based way. So for example, when I was at Northeastern Law School, one of the questions was about a charter school started by a Native American tribe. And the Native American tribes started that school because they wanted curriculum and pedagogy that was more relevant for their community. That kind of charter school makes sense to me. Corporate charter schools don't make as much sense to me because of the reasons that we're talking about. Another good example of this is Travis Heights Elementary, where the faith community, the teachers' organization, the teachers in that school, the local community had a vote to decide if they wanted their school to be a charter school instead of a magnet or any other set of alternatives that are out there. And so as a community, they made that decision. Previously, the decision had been made for them by the school board, and they had hired a particular charter school corporation to come in and run that school. So there are community-based ways that we can approach charter schools. They don't have to be for profit. They don't have to be disinterested in equity. We can have schools that are accessible to the communities where those kids live. So in the spring, I first introduced the idea of aristocratic reformers during my Cambridge Forum talk that I gave in Harvard Square. And you can check out the longer discussion about aristocratic reformers there on my YouTube channel. But it's very clear that top-down and private control reform has marshaled extensive resources to fund an ecology to reach into communities, into the halls of Congress, across the spectrum in our society. And not to pick on them too much, I actually haven't mentioned them, oh, I did mention them once. Teacher America. The national and local ecology that Teacher America has created is unparalleled. Let me give you an example from New Orleans. There's a really interesting peer-reviewed paper by Carrie Kretschmar that details how Teacher America was the primary node by which reform occurred in New Orleans. And they show, they conduct a network analysis of how the charter schools, the foundations, were all connected through this ecology was created and maintained, maybe I shouldn't say created, was maintained and interacted by Teacher America. You see Teacher America creating this network and this ecology on the national level. Two interesting examples. One, a billionaire from San Jose, California, funded TFA to be the staffers for Democrats and Republicans on the Senate and House education committees. So imagine if the petroleum industry said, you know, we would like to fund the staffers on energy for the Democrats and the Republicans on the Energy Committee in the House and Senate side. Could you imagine the outcry? But yet Teacher America is able to embed their education staffers in the offices of Republicans and Democrats on these committees. It's brilliant. Now, another thing that a lot of people are not really aware of is that Teacher America has also penetrated the civil rights organizations in DC. What do I mean by this? I recently blogged about this. I was really surprised when the civil rights organizations signed on to a letter that came out against parents opting out of testing across the United States. That sounded a little curious to me. So like the investigative journalist that I am, I checked with some of my DC sources to understand where was this coming from. And it turns out that a Teacher America alum inside of one of the civil rights organizations, who happens to be Anglo, was leading this charge and having the civil rights organization sign on not only to being anti-opt-out, but being pro-high-stakes testing. And let's be real, folks. High-stakes testing was created in China 1,500 years ago to sort society. That's what high-stakes tests still do today. High-stakes tests sort society. And so I think that it's quite disappointing, it's quite upsetting that the civil rights organizations in DC that the Teach for America folks have embedded into these organizations and created this ecology to promote high-stakes testing, to continue this privatization of testing, all under the guise of civil rights. During the question and answer after my Cambridge Forum lecture, a parent asked what she could do to controvert the aristocratic reformers. The teacher who was the moderator on the stage said something to the effect, "I'm not rich, I'm not wealthy, what can I do?" At the time, I termed it people power, and I've had some months to think about what that means. We often focus on how organizations can interact, how we can ally, how we can form coalitions. But today, I want to instead focus on how we individually can interact, ally, and form coalitions on behalf of community-based reform. social media is now the technological canvas by which we can combat the aristocratic reformers. I see some bloggers in the room. I will give them some shout outs. A canvas which has none of the traditional gatekeepers. Because if you think about it, if you want to send an op-ed, who's the gatekeeper at the newspaper? If you want to get a particular story on MSNBC, you have the producer, that's the gatekeeper. But what social media allows us to do is to have the canvas by which no one can be our gatekeeper. So I'd like to quickly discuss a few social media platforms and talk about how to utilize them to create your own personal ecology for community-based reform. You know, often we come to these talks and we go away and we say, that was nice, what can I do? And so I really want to talk to you about how you can create your own personal ecology around education. Okay, and then I'm supposed to go, hit it. Is he ready? Oh. You ready? Okay. So I'm just going to run through a couple of quick things. So first, the primary thing that I do, you know, as a faculty member, you have to make some decisions. And you've heard the term publish or perish. So fortunately now I'm a full professor, and it allows me to do this kind of work. And I get this question often from assistant folks. But one of the things that I spend a lot of my time on is communicating scholarship to the public, to policymakers, to parents, to communities, to teachers, and also using my blog to give voice to folks. One of the things that I often do is I am able to provide voice to Teach for America alums, either anonymous or on the record, about their experiences in schools. And I do that quite often. In fact, one of my own former students from the University of Texas wrote one of the most popular posts ever on my blog. Let's see if you can see it. Here it is. Tell all from TFA and KIP teacher, unprepared, isolation, shame, and burnout. That was her experience as a first-year teacher in KIP as a TFA core member. And this may look like CNN, but this is a one-man show, folks. You know, over time, you sort of learn some of the tricks of the trade. But this allows me, you know, they talk about the ivory tower, and you know what they say about the ivory tower. Rapunzel very rarely lets down her hair, right? And so this is my opportunity to make my scholarship accessible and also have a community of scholars be able to make their work accessible. And Dr. Shirazi wanted me to say why I started my blog, so I'm going to do that. This is not part of what I expected to say. But I wrote a piece that was published in the Berkeley Review of Education on KIP, charter schools. And what we found in the Texas data was that 40% of African American kids were leaving KIP before their senior year. Now, comparable numbers for the district in Houston was around 5%. Now, what was interesting about this is that KIP often says that they have 100% graduation rates and 100% apply to college. But what they really should be saying, at least for black kids, is that 100% and 60% are going on to college, which in my stats class is not really 100%, right? And so KIP pushed back really hard, right? Because they have marketing people, they have public relations people, they have a website, and I had no recourse, right? And then I went on Melissa Harris Perry in 2012 and first started talking about this, and Jonathan Alter blew his top and said, I'm not going to allow you to diss KIP charter schools on national television. Right? You know, I thought of that as him exemplifying privilege. So I thought to myself, I need to be able to respond to this. And so that was the genesis of this. And in that summer, I was on faculty in Black Studies. They actually had a training about how faculty can prosecute blogs. Now, let me warn you, a blog is a lot of work. And sometimes you feel like a slave to your blog, because in the back of your mind, you have to be preparing the next blog post, right? I see some insanity up there. So that's one of the things. You know, you can do a blog, because that's what a lot of folks automatically in their mind go to when they think, I want to create an ecology, I'm going to start a blog. But let me just tell you, it's a big commitment, right? But it can have a big impact. Okay, so let's talk, let's do a fun one. Let's talk about Instagram. You're like, Instagram. So I've just recently started to use Instagram, and one of the reasons why I started, here's a couple of photos from today. Did you know that IAS has their own M&Ms. So that's the kind of thing that I can put on Instagram, right? Because it's interesting, right? So I think I like to use Instagram, A, because of the audience that it reaches, right? There's a lot younger folks and students, right? The other thing I like to use Instagram because it allows you to be a little more artsy than say like a Twitter or a LinkedIn, which is not really appropriate to post artsy photos on a place like LinkedIn, right? And it, you know, it's like just a different, that's the form that Instagram is. Now LinkedIn, I think the best way to use LinkedIn is it allows you to create the largest ecology and have direct contact with folks. So my ecology on LinkedIn or my connections is 7,500. And what's interesting about this is it provides a lot of different opportunities. One, you can do what they call posts. So it's kind of like you can do your own blog post here. And it's going to go to the inbox of all 7,500 people. Now, does that mean that all 7,000 people are going to read that post? No. I usually average 200 to 400 people. But at least you have an opportunity to get those eyeballs. Because you know how it is. Information nowadays is coming at us like a water hose, right? And so with LinkedIn is a little different than Facebook, and I'll talk about Facebook in a minute, but it allows you to communicate to every single person you're connected with. Facebook, we were talking about gatekeepers, has a gatekeeping function, and I'll mention that in just a second. Another great thing about LinkedIn, and two more tips, right? The first tip is, you know how you get emails and you're on a list with a bunch of folks? And so one of the things you can do with LinkedIn is if you go here, you can actually add folks by their email list and build your network rapidly. So let's say I get an email about ed policy and Latinos, and there's folks on there that I'd like to be connected with. All I have to do is cut and paste those emails out of whatever the email came in, paste it into my LinkedIn, and then I automatically can send invitations to folks. You can't do that kind of thing in LinkedIn. You can't do that kind of thing in Twitter, but it allows you to grow. And the other thing is that it allows you to have a Rolodex, a really, really cool Rolodex. So if you hear that somebody was just appointed to the Hillary campaign, and you would like to be able to communicate with her, right? She wasn't at the Hillary campaign before, she was at a different foundation. Well, it turns out you were connected with her on LinkedIn. So now, because you connected with someone, you know, a year or 2 years ago, and you want to communicate a message to them, you can do so because LinkedIn is this really fantastic Rolodex of contact information, okay? Well, it looks like people are tweeting at me in ridiculous numbers here. So there's 37 new notifications. Now, some of you think to yourself, I don't want to do Twitter. It's you know, and you might be thinking this to yourself about all of these things, right? And yes, it's true. There's a time commitment involved. But you're here because you're collecting information. You're curious. Well, what Twitter will do for you is if you follow the right people, the information will come to you. That great New York Times article that you don't have time to sort through the New York Times to find is going to come to you, right? And you don't have to get on Twitter because you want 2 million followers like the latest Bollywood actor, right? You can get on Twitter just because you want to follow folks and the information comes to you. You don't necessarily have to worry about how many followers you have, right? I only have 3,500 followers or something like that. But yet, Harvard Education Next named the 9th most influential person on social media, even though the people above me have many, many more followers, right? So you don't want to measure yourself based on your followers. And the thing is that nothing is too much on Twitter. You can tweet 72 times a day and nobody will care because it goes by really fast. If you put 72 posts on Facebook, how are your friends going to respond? Right? So if you really want to say a lot, Twitter's the place where you can do that. You can say a lot here. Okay? And you can, by mentioning them, so what you're looking at my notifications, these are all people that have mentioned me. So let's just see. This is for the progressive. If you put somebody's name, if you do mention their Twitter name, it'll go right to them. So you can also communicate, like how many of you listen to Public Enemy? Anybody? Chuck D? Okay. So I sent a message to Chuck D about a song that really spoke to me at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? About don't give up the fight, because sometimes we feel a little discouraged. And so I sent him a Twitter message. The brother added me, right? He read it, right? So you can communicate with people. How else would I have been able to communicate with Chuck D from Public Enemy? So that also has that really cool aspect, okay? And then finally, see, I'm getting stuff from folks. Yes, I might be here on October the 31st when the University of Michigan plays the University of Minnesota. If you have tickets, please let me know. So Facebook is where you're going to get your most exposure because almost everybody has Facebook. The problem with Facebook is it has an algorithm. And what I mean by that is when you put a post, not everybody sees it. Now, nobody really knows what the Facebook algorithm is for people to see your posts. There are ways that you can, for example, highlight particular posts, and in theory that means it's going to go to more people. But as you can see, I have 3,392 connections on Facebook. Of those, I probably know 5% of the people on Facebook because I daily get people adding me. So your posts obviously don't go to 3,000 people. So the way I think, and this is, I don't know this because it's a closely guarded secret, is it appears that Facebook will communicate people who you are communicating with. So if you're messaging folks, or if you're liking their stuff, or they like your things, then your post will get visibility to those people. Otherwise, and it looks like they give you a couple of opportunities to like different folks, and then those people leave your feed, right? So Facebook does have a gatekeeper function, but it's still the way that, for example, my blog probably draws 80% of its viewership from Facebook. Okay, did I cover all of them? I think I did. And I want to leave time for questions about these things. So let me do the crescendo. Okay. So I think it's important to draw strength from our allies. Via social media, we can individually create new alliances and an individual ecology. But, as you're thinking to yourself right now, it requires commitment, it requires creativity, and it requires some bravery. Because as you open yourself up to engaging in these issues, you will inevitably draw critics. As you can probably see from my work on cloaking inequity and social media, I've also learned it's important to know history and real stories. You draw purpose from the really lived experiences of people, not just the numbers. As a quantoid, I always have to slap myself a little bit and say, it's not just about the numbers. It's about the counter-narrative and the stories that come from communities. That's how you create a whole picture of our community's needs and desires for policymakers and policy influencers. As you create your own personal social media ecology, you will be challenged by powerful structures. So be prepared to fight those battles with allies and inspire those who come after you to do the same. To paraphrase one of my favorite quotes, I challenge you today to connect enthusiastically, give relentlessly, and then lead bravely. If we do this, a future of community-based education reform can be ours. Thank you.